They descended into the deepest cave on Earth, and no one was ready for what awaited them below Dot. What began as a simple scientific expedition turned into an encounter with something that was never meant to exist. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. Marcus Daniels had always believed that silence was a kind of mercy. After years spent in the desert heat of Afghanistan, where every sound carried the weight of death, he had learned to crave quiet, yet it was that same silence that now haunted him. The kind that followed explosions, the kind that stayed when the world stopped screaming. It was that silence that filled his apartment every night in Atlanta, where the ticking of the wall clock felt louder than artillery. He had turned 40 a few months ago, though he already carried the posture of someone older. The old scars on his shoulder, the stiffness in his left knee, the sleepless nights filled with flashes of sand and fire, they had shaped him into a man who no longer trusted peace. He worked now as a documentarian, wandering from one obscure project to another, chasing what others feared to look at. Remote tribes, forgotten battlefields, ghost towns consumed by nature. His films were raw, unpolished, but real, honest enough to win small festivals, never big enough to change his life. He survived from one commission to another, carrying his battered camera bag and the weight of his past like a single burden. Most of his nights were spent editing alone, the flicker of the screen reflecting off tired eyes, while the city outside hummed with lives more stable than his. One morning, between the spam and overdue bills, he noticed an email that seemed out of place. The subject line was simple: Expedition Proposal, Bariobkin Cave. The message was short, formal, and strangely confident, sent by an institute he had never heard of, a partnership between a Georgian geological university and a small American research foundation based in Savannah. They wanted him to join a scientific expedition to the Caucasus Mountains to document the descent into the deepest known cave on Earth. All expenses paid. Full creative freedom. A chance to capture what no human eye had truly seen. At first, Marcus thought it was a mistake. He had filmed volcanoes, crumbling cathedrals, refugee camps, but never anything involving pure geology. Yet, the more he read, the more it pulled him in. The words, "the deepest natural cavity on Earth," struck him with something between awe and dread. The invitation was more than professional. It felt almost personal. There was something in it that whispered to him, something about going down, descending, facing the dark. He reread the message several times that day. They mentioned a multinational team: Russians, Georgians, French, and 2 Americans, and the need for a filmmaker who could withstand extreme environments. They had seen his work from the Arctic, and his footage from the Afghan caves where he had once followed local shepherds. That was their reason for choosing him. Yet Marcus knew it was more than that. Somewhere, deep inside, he felt the pull of a test. The same inner call that used to make him volunteer for the hardest missions, not for glory, but for the feeling of standing at the edge of something that could swallow him whole. For days, he couldn't decide. He looked at the ceiling of his small apartment, the cracks that resembled maps of places he had never been. He thought about his father, a man of the South who had worked himself to death in a factory, believing the world never gave men like them a way out. Marcus had escaped through the military, then through film, but the truth was he'd never really escaped at all. He'd only gone deeper inside himself, into quieter and darker tunnels. When he finally accepted the offer, he told no one. In the following weeks, the world began to shrink around preparations. He studied old Soviet records about the Bariobkin Cave, long-forgotten scans of yellowed documents where men with rough hands had written coordinates and numbers that descended into madness. There were reports of collapses, of lost radio signals, of climbers returning mute or broken. Some claim the cave breathed at night, its air warm and pulsing, as if the mountain itself were alive. The official records dismiss these tales as geological anomalies, but Marcus had been in enough places where the line between fact and fear was thin as dust. He didn't believe or disbelieve. He simply noted the pattern, how every expedition ended abruptly, the notes always stopping mid-sentence, the final line almost identical. Mission terminated for safety reasons. He began to dream of narrow passages and falling lights. In one of those dreams, he was crawling through a tunnel no wider than his shoulders, the camera shaking in his hands. Something moved ahead, unseen but present, and when he turned around, the tunnel behind him had vanished. He woke, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding, the sound of his own breath echoing in the stillness of the room. It took him a full minute to realize he was safe. Then he wasn't sure if safe was even the right word anymore. The flight to Moscow was long, filled with faces that blurred into anonymity. From there, he boarded a small, rattling plane to Tbilisi, then a military-style helicopter to a remote station near the Abkhazian border. The farther they went, the more the world seemed to peel away, leaving only raw landscape, mountains like sleeping giants, their white crowns hidden under fog. He watched from the window as rivers cut through the valleys that looked untouched by civilization. The noise of the rotors drowned out every other sound, leaving him alone with his thoughts. At the base of the mountains, the expedition's main camp waited. It was a cluster of tents and steel containers half buried in frost. The team that greeted him looked both professional and uneasy. There were 12 in total, scientists, engineers, and climbers, each carrying the calm of those who knew danger intimately. The leader was a broad-shouldered man named Demidov, a veteran of Russian cave explorations. His English was rough but clear, his eyes sharp and sleepless. When Marcus introduced himself, the man only nodded and said, "Here, the mountain decides who stays." In the days that followed, Marcus filmed everything. The supplies being unpacked, the testing of ropes and oxygen meters, the nervous laughter over freeze-dried meals. He noticed that no one ever looked directly at the cave's mouth. It loomed at the edge of the camp, a black wound in the pale rock framed by frost-bitten pines. Even the locals avoided it. One old shepherd, leathery and silent, refused to go near, muttering in Georgian that the mountain breathes and the breath kills. At night, as the temperature dropped and mist swallowed the camp, Marcus could hear the faint hum of wind moving through the entrance. It was not a normal sound. It was low and rhythmic, like a slow heartbeat muffled by miles of stone. He tried to tell himself it was an echo of air pressure changes, but something about its cadence felt deliberate. He found himself standing outside his tent for long minutes, camera in hand, listening to that impossible pulse until it seemed to match his own. When the morning of the descent finally came, Marcus stood at the mouth of the cave, the harness biting into his waist, the cold metal of the rope slick under his gloves. The others moved with routine precision, checking knots, adjusting lights, securing packs. His camera recorded the moment automatically, the red light blinking like a heartbeat in the dark. He felt the shift in air immediately, the warmth exhaling from within, a subtle mist curling outward like the breath of something vast and sleeping. It smelled of iron, of wet stone, and decay. For a brief second, as he pointed his camera into that blackness, Marcus thought he saw movement deep within, something faint and shifting, like water stirring in a pit. The light from his lamp reached only a few feet before it dissolved into total absence. He pressed record, zoomed in, and whispered the date and time for the log, but his own voice sounded foreign, thinner than usual, as though the cave had already begun to swallow it. Behind him, Demidov gave the order to move. One by one, the team disappeared into the dark, swallowed whole by the earth. When it was his turn, Marcus looked up at the pale sky one last time. It was gray and lifeless, the clouds hanging low, pressing against the peaks as if trying to seal the world above. He took a breath, tasting metal on his tongue, and stepped over the edge. The light from the surface vanished almost instantly. The rope groaned, the carabiners clinked against rock, and the sound of his own descent became the only rhythm that mattered. The temperature dropped for a moment, then rose again, a wave of heat from below brushing against his face. The deeper he went, the more he felt it, an invisible presence, watching, waiting. His headlamp illuminated the rock walls that seemed to pulse with their own faint moisture, veins glistening like skin under sweat. The air was alive, and he realized with a strange calm that he was no longer entering a geological formation. He was entering something that breathed. At the first landing, he switched off the camera for a moment and looked down into the endless vertical shaft beneath him. The light from his lamp reached maybe 20 feet before fading into complete black. Somewhere below, he could hear the metallic echoes of the others setting ropes. It wasn't the sound of rock against steel. It was slower, deliberate, almost like a reply. He shook the thought away, but it stayed. The mountain was not silent. When he resumed recording, his hand trembled slightly. The red light blinked again, and for a second the lens fogged from his breath. He wiped it clean, aimed it downward, and said quietly into the mic, "Entry point, 2,270 meters above sea level. Baryobkin Cave. Descent begins." His voice vanished into the dark, absorbed, devoured. The world above was gone. The sound of the wind was replaced by the dripping of unseen water and the faint rustle of his own movement. The cave closed around him, ancient and patient, as if it had been waiting for this, for him to return to where all things end. And as he followed the last glimmers of the team's light into the abyss, Marcus realized that for the first time in years he was not haunted by the silence. He was inside it. And the silence was breathing back. The first sensation that struck Marcus after stepping beyond the mouth of the cave was weight. Not physical, but atmospheric, as if the very air thickened around him, pressing against his chest and eardrums. The rope creaked as he descended, the sound echoing upward like the faint wail of something ancient and slow. The light from his helmet traced the jagged limestone walls, revealing glistening streams of condensation that reflected back in trembling ripples. Above, the surface world had already vanished. The last traces of daylight were swallowed by the narrow shaft, replaced by the steady flicker of their lamps, 12 small hearts beating in the dark. They moved cautiously, step by step, the descent taking them through passages that twisted like veins. The deeper they went, the less sound existed. Even the metal clinks of their gear seemed muffled, as though the cave itself absorbed noise, digesting it. Marcus's camera hung against his chest, recording intermittently, the lens fogging with every exhale. He could feel sweat forming under his gloves despite the chill that should have accompanied such depth. It was as if the cave generated its own heat, an invisible pulse rising from below. Each landing revealed a new layer of the Earth's anatomy. wet stone shimmering like bone, narrow fissures where wind whispered through unseen corridors, and chambers where the ceiling disappeared beyond the reach of light. The scientists were clinical, efficient, measuring humidity, checking readings, logging coordinates. Yet even the most disciplined among them hesitated before moving on, pausing to listen to something they couldn't quite name. Marcus, trailing behind with his camera, captured those brief hesitations, the sideways glances, the flickers of unease, like a hunter cataloging the first signs of fear. By the time they reached the first base camp, nearly 400 meters down, Marcus's muscles ached, his shoulders throbbed, and a low ringing filled his ears. It was subtle at first, like the tinnitus he'd carried from his time in the army, but steadier, rhythmic, persistent. He tried to ignore it, telling himself it was the echo of dripping water. But when he turned off his headlamp to rest, the ringing grew louder, vibrating through the helmet strap like a slow hum. He tapped the side of his head, the universal gesture of denial, but the sound remained. The others set up tents, unpacking supplies and securing equipment against the slick floor. Demidov, the expedition leader, kept everyone focused, his voice deep and commanding in the stillness. "We moved to the next stage at dawn," he said, though dawn meant nothing here. The only time was the ticking of their digital watches and the steady drip from the stalactites above. When the lights dimmed, the darkness filled every corner, so complete that Marcus could not tell whether his eyes were open or closed. He drifted in and out of shallow sleep, haunted by the impression that something was moving beyond the thin fabric of the tent. When he woke, the others were already preparing to descend farther. The smell in the air had changed. It was no longer the clean scent of stone and mineral, but something damp and faintly metallic, like iron rusting under water. He tasted it when he breathed through his mouth, a flavor of blood and soil. His camera picked up the shimmer of moisture on the walls, forming delicate patterns like veins. When he zoomed in to focus, he noticed grooves, deep scratches running vertically across the rock. They were long and parallel, carved with unnatural precision. He called one of the geologists over, a Frenchman named Laurent, who examined the markings under his flashlight. "Rock shift," Laurent said after a pause, his accent flattening the words. "Pressure lines." But Marcus had seen pressure fractures before, and these were different. They ran too evenly, and their direction was wrong, upward, not downward, as though something inside had clawed toward the surface. He didn't argue, only filmed the grooves for the record. The camera captured the fine sediment lodged within them, like dust trapped in the ridges of fingernails. They continued downward, crossing narrow shafts where the rock closed in so tightly they had to turn sideways to fit through. Each meter felt heavier, the air denser. By 600 meters, the temperature had risen slightly, an anomaly noted by the scientists but dismissed as a local heat pocket. Marcus felt sweat pooling between his shoulder blades, the back of his neck prickling. His breathing became shallow, not from fear, but from resistance. The air felt thicker, harder to draw in, as if it carried more weight than oxygen should. The radio signals began to falter. Static hissed through the headsets whenever they tried to contact the upper camp. The communication technician, a quiet Georgian woman named Irina, adjusted the frequency dials, her brow furrowed. "Signal bounce," she muttered, though her tone lacked conviction. Marcus filmed her face as she listened through the headset. Her expression was that of someone hearing not interference, but a whisper. She removed the earpiece abruptly, shaking her head. "It's nothing," she said, though her hands trembled as she reattached it. By the time they reached the next resting point at around 900 meters, fatigue had dulled their conversation. No one cracked jokes anymore. Even Demidov's voice had grown curt, mechanical. Marcus noted how everyone seemed to avoid looking too long into the tunnels ahead, how their headlamps darted away quickly as if fearing to glimpse something waiting just beyond the reach of light. The deeper chambers amplified sound in strange ways. A cough from one corner might echo as a whisper from another. At one point, Marcus turned abruptly. Sure, someone had spoken his name, but there was no one behind him. He began to keep a personal audio log, recording fragments of his thoughts. "We are 950 meters below the surface," he whispered into the microphone. "The air feels alive. Not just warm, thick like it's breathing. Everyone's tired. The static on the radios doesn't sound random anymore. It has a rhythm." He paused, listening. The silence after his words was complete. Then, just as he was about to stop the recording, he heard a faint echo of his own voice. A playback from nowhere, slightly distorted, repeating the last line. "It has a rhythm." The sound faded like a sigh. He replayed the recording later, but the echo was gone. Only the steady hiss of empty air remained. He didn't mention it to anyone. That night, when the camp settled into uneasy rest, Marcus kept his light on. He reviewed the footage from the previous hours. Most of it was mundane. People climbing, measuring, logging data. But near the end of one clip, as Demidov led the group through a narrow crevice, Marcus noticed a movement at the edge of the frame. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. A dark blur passing across the far wall opposite their light sources. The logical part of his mind said it was a trick of shadows. The rest of him, the part that still dreamed of desert caves and unseen snipers, knew better. Something had moved against the direction of their light. He paused the footage, magnified the area frame by frame. The blur had no shape, no definite boundary, only motion. It was darker than the darkness around it, a shade that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. After a minute, he stopped watching. His hands were shaking, though the tent was warm. The next morning, they began the descent to the second camp. The passage narrowed into a vertical chute, forcing them to rappel one at a time. Marcus went third. The sound of his harness scraping against rock echoed for long seconds after each movement. About halfway down, he froze. From below, faint but distinct, came the sound of tapping. Metal on stone, irregular, deliberate. 3 slow knocks, a pause, then 2 shorter ones. He waited, listening. No one else reacted. When he reached the bottom, he asked Demidov if someone had been signaling. The leader frowned. No one touched anything. They pressed on, each meter stretching the silence tighter. At one point, the humidity became so thick that droplets formed mid-air, floating like condensation in a lung. Their lamps reflected off the moisture, scattering halos of light that pulsed faintly. Marcus's camera caught the effect beautifully, though he couldn't shake the sense that the halos moved slightly against the airflow, as though guided by something unseen. By the time they stopped again to rest, everyone was breathing heavier. The medic distributed electrolyte packets and anti-nausea pills. "It's just pressure," she said, but her own voice was unsteady. Marcus drank from his flask and stared at the rock wall opposite him. The grooves were back, fresh as if newly cut. He ran a gloved finger along one and felt the rawness of the edge. The stone was still damp, as if whatever had made the mark had done so recently. He looked over his shoulder, the beam of his light slicing the darkness. No one was near. The last entry in his log that day was almost a whisper. "We've reached 1,500 meters. The air smells like iron. The stone feels warm. There are markings on the walls that weren't there before. I keep thinking the echoes are late, but maybe they're early, like the cave answers before we speak." He stopped, letting the words sink into the recorder. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, pressing down from every direction. As the team prepared to move again, Marcus turned off his light for a brief moment, wanting to experience total darkness. It was supposed to be absolute, a scientist's measure of pure black. But after a few seconds, he realized it wasn't. There was still something faintly visible, a suggestion of movement, a glow that wasn't light but presence. He blinked, convinced it was imagination. Then someone behind him whispered, "Did you see that?" He turned, heart hammering, but the voice belonged to no one. Everyone else was ahead of him, already clipping onto the next line. The descent continued, relentless, mechanical. Ropes creaked, boots slipped on wet rock, helmets knocked against walls slick with moisture. The deeper they went, the more Marcus felt the pressure behind his eyes, like the mountain itself was leaning closer, studying them. When they finally reached the next camp at 1,800 meters, the exhaustion was total. The team barely spoke. They ate in silence, their faces pale, their gestures robotic. Marcus sat apart from the others, back against the wall, camera in his lap. He switched it on without recording, just to use the screen as a faint light source. In the glow, he saw droplets sliding down the wall beside him. For a moment, he thought it was water. Then he realized the droplets were moving upward, against gravity, slowly tracing the direction of the scratches. His throat tightened. He turned off the screen. The darkness swallowed everything, and the faint hum returned, steady and pulsing, like breath drawn from deep within the stone. When he finally closed his eyes, the image of the moving droplets stayed behind them. He knew, even before sleep took him, that something in this place was alive. It might not have flesh or bone, but it listened. And now it knew their rhythm. By the time the third day began, the line between waking and sleeping had blurred into something indistinct. No one could tell if they had truly rested or simply drifted into a temporary pause between waves of exhaustion. The air inside the cave seemed to change with every breath. One moment, thin and metallic, the next heavy and moist, like the lung of something immense breathing just out of sight. Marcus sat near the edge of their camp, recording his thoughts in low whispers that merged with the endless drip of water echoing from the ceiling. The sound of his own voice felt fragile here, easily devoured by the stillness. The lights from their helmets cast a dull amber over the walls, enough to show that the limestone glistened with a sheen that wasn't just water. There were faint streaks of red embedded in the rock, mineral traces perhaps, though Marcus could not shake the feeling that they looked disturbingly like veins. Every so often, he would glance at them and imagine he saw them pulse, but he told himself it was fatigue. Everything here was an illusion of movement. The stone shifted when you blinked, the shadows changed their edges when you looked too long. The team's mood had darkened. The jokes and laughter that had marked the first day were gone. Even Demidov's commands had become quieter, delivered with clipped precision, as if he feared his voice might stir something in the walls. They moved mechanically, tightening ropes, checking sensors, speaking in monosyllables. The human presence felt temporary now, a brief flicker of noise swallowed by the patience of the mountain. When the incident with Victor happened, it was almost expected, though no one said so. He was the youngest of the group, a Russian speleologist who always walked ahead with restless energy, humming old songs to himself. That morning, his humming stopped. They found him sitting on the ground beside the narrow corridor that led to the next shaft. His lamp was still on, pointed at nothing. His breathing came fast and shallow, and his hands trembled on his knees. When Demidov crouched beside him, Viktor didn't move. His eyes were open, staring straight ahead, but unfocused, as though he were watching something none of them could see. Marcus turned his camera on out of habit. The frame caught the entire moment. The silence, the flicker of headlamps, the distant drip of water. Viktor began to murmur, barely audible at first. The words were in Russian, but Demidov translated in a whisper. He says, "We're not alone here." The phrase hung in the air like mist. No one spoke after that. They'd decided to bring Viktor back to the previous camp, but even as they secured him to the rope line, his muttering continued. His head turned toward the rock wall, and his eyes followed something invisible moving there. When they finally carried him upward, his voice faded until it became indistinguishable from the echo of their own steps. The team gathered to discuss what had happened, but the conversation quickly devolved into unease. The French geologist, Laurent, insisted it was oxygen deprivation. The medic agreed, citing exhaustion, dehydration, and sensory disorientation. Yet Marcus saw doubt in all their faces. They had prepared for those things, measured for them, and none of the data supported the explanation. Still, no one wanted to admit that fear had already entered their ranks. When the camp settled again, Marcus lay awake, listening. There was a new sound now beneath the dripping water and the faint hum of air currents. It was softer, lower, almost imperceptible, a vibration, steady and rhythmic. It reminded him of something biological, the faint hum of a heartbeat heard through stethoscopes during his time filming in the field hospitals. He pressed his ear against the rock beside him. The vibration deepened, became clearer. It wasn't coming from the surface or from machinery. It came from the stone itself. He woke abruptly later, unsure if he had slept or merely drifted. The sound was gone, but a thin fog clung to the floor of the chamber, swirling faintly around the equipment. The others were still asleep. The mist wasn't normal. It shimmered faintly when light touched it, like dust suspended in liquid. When he ran his gloved hand through it, the fog parted, revealing fresh moisture on the floor beneath, forming tiny rivulets that traced upward along the rock. He told himself it was condensation, though he'd never seen it behave like that. When morning came, or what passed for morning by their watches, the mood was brittle. Demidov announced they would push forward to the next section. No one argued. They packed in silence, each movement deliberate, mechanical. As they advanced, the corridors grew tighter, the air heavier. The sound of dripping water followed them like footsteps. Every few meters, Marcus filmed, his camera light cutting narrow cones through the black. On one of the walls, he noticed new scratches. These were deeper than before, each one about the width of a finger. They trailed upward in uneven arcs, converging toward a single point near the ceiling. He reached up with the camera, zoomed in, and saw something lodged between two of the scratches, a fragment of material darker than the surrounding rock. He scraped at it gently. It came loose easily, leaving a smear on his glove. It wasn't stone. It was softer, like keratin. He said nothing, slipping it quietly into a sample bag. Later, as they rested before descending into the next shaft, Laurent approached him. "You noticed it too," he said quietly, eyes darting toward the ceiling. "The marks, they're fresh. They weren't there before." Marcus didn't answer. Laurent gave a small, bitter laugh. "I keep telling myself it's rock movement, pressure. But rocks don't make marks that look like this." He tapped his notebook where he had drawn the pattern, a spiral of lines converging upward as though something deep below was struggling toward the surface. That night, they heard the first whisper. It happened while they were reviewing footage, sitting around the dim glow of their lamps. The radio crackled faintly, a hiss of static. Then, through it, came a sound that froze everyone mid-breath. It wasn't speech exactly, not yet. It was a low murmur, a series of soft tones, too rhythmic to be random interference. It lasted less than 10 seconds before dissolving back into static. No one spoke. Irina, the communications technician, stared at the radio as if it had betrayed her. "Feedback," she said finally, though her voice shook. "From the lower chamber." But Marcus had seen her eyes when the sound came through. She'd heard what he had, a cadence too human to dismiss. Later, after the others lay down, he listened to the playback through his headphones. At first, only static. Then, faintly, a voice, filtered and distorted, speaking in a language he couldn't place. He rewound the tape 3 times before realizing that it wasn't a language at all. It was his own name, stretched and warped, as though someone far away were trying to pronounce it through a mouthful of water. He didn't tell anyone. He simply turned off the recorder, placed it face down, and sat there in the dark, trying to slow his breathing. The following day, Laurent vanished. It happened between one checkpoint and another, a space of barely 30 meters. He'd been second in line, and when they reached the next chamber, he was gone. No sound, no call for help, no broken rope. They searched the side tunnels for hours, finding nothing except his helmet light, still on, resting against a wall. The beam illuminated a section of rock slick with moisture. Beneath it, etched into the stone, were fresh scratches, parallel lines, 5 of them, running upward. The discovery shattered the team's composure. Some wanted to ascend immediately. Others argued they needed to find him first. Demidov's authority began to falter under the weight of fear. Marcus filmed as they argued, though he felt guilt for doing so. He wasn't recording evidence anymore. He was documenting collapse. When they finally stopped searching, the silence felt heavier than before, dense enough to press against their throats. That night, Marcus dreamed he was still holding the camera. The light flickered, revealing the narrow tunnel ahead. At the far end, a figure stood, tall, featureless, glistening like stone. When he lifted the lens to focus, the figure tilted its head, and the sound of breathing filled the tunnel, not his own, but something slower, deeper. He woke, gasping. The image burned into his eyelids. For a long time he sat motionless, certain he could still hear it, the faint rhythm of inhalation and exhalation coming from somewhere behind the walls. He tried to rationalize it. Sound carried strangely down here, distorted by the structure of the tunnels. He told himself that again and again as the team packed to move deeper. But, as he fastened his harness, his hand brushed the rock beside him, and it was warm, noticeably, unnaturally warm. He pulled his glove back and touched it again. The surface vibrated faintly, like a muscle beneath skin. By the time they reached the next chamber, the air was different. It no longer smelled of earth and stone, but something sharper. Ozone, metal, the aftertaste of blood. Their lamps flickered as though the cave were absorbing the electricity. The medic complained of dizziness. Irina said her radio was picking up low-frequency interference. Marcus's camera light dimmed unexpectedly and then flared bright again, casting long, trembling shadows that seemed to shift a moment too late, like reflections of movements already made. They stopped to rest. No one ate. No one spoke. Marcus reviewed his footage mechanically, frame after frame, until one sequence made him freeze. It was a shot of Victor before his breakdown, sitting by the wall, staring at the stone. For a single frame, barely a fraction of a second, something else was visible behind him emerging from the darkness. A blur, not quite human, with angles that bent the wrong way. It was gone as soon as it appeared. He played it back several times, slowing it, but each time the image seemed to change slightly, as if resisting capture. When he finally shut the camera off, he felt a presence at his back. The air behind him moved, just enough to brush the hair at the nape of his neck. He turned slowly. Nothing but darkness. Yet the warmth lingered, the undeniable impression of breath. They moved again, descending toward the fourth camp. Marcus kept close to Demidov now, not trusting the gaps that formed between them. The tunnels narrowed, forcing them into single file. Every scrape of rope and boot seemed magnified. At one point, the walls pressed so tightly that the fabric of Marcus's jacket snagged on the rock. As he twisted free, his light swept across the stone, and there, inches from his face, were more markings, deeper than before, the edges sharp, glistening wetly. He exhaled, and his breath condensed on the surface, forming beads that trembled before running upward along the grooves. He said nothing. There was nothing to say that would make sense. When they finally reached the next chamber and secured the camp, exhaustion made them move like sleepwalkers. No one mentioned Laurent, or Victor, or the Whispers, but when the lights were dimmed and the others tried to rest, Marcus could still hear faint voices drifting through the stone, like conversations held in another room. The words were indistinct, yet their tone was unmistakably human, curious, questioning, almost tender. He pressed the recorder against the wall and waited. The voice came again, a whisper that seemed to rise from deep below. "Why did you come here?" The words were soft, stretched, almost sighing. When he pulled the recorder away, his hands were shaking so violently he could barely turn it off. He didn't sleep that night. He sat with his back to the wall, the camera in his lap, watching the others breathe. At some point, the rhythmic vibration returned beneath him, matching the rise and fall of his chest. The mountain was breathing again, and this time it was breathing with them. The next descent began in silence. No one dared mention the whisper that had carried through the rock the night before. It lingered in their heads, suspended between disbelief and dread. Marcus did not replay the recording. He didn't need to. The words were already carved into his memory, each syllable etched with precision. Why did you come here? It had not been a hallucination. The others might have denied hearing it, but he could see it in their faces that morning as they packed, each movement slow, deliberate, as if they feared the noise might summon something listening in the dark. The air felt different now, denser. It no longer simply filled their lungs, it pushed back. Every breath came with resistance, a subtle pressure that made the chest ache. The sound of boots on rock had changed too, softer, more muted, as though the ground beneath had become porous. The headlamps flickered often, even the batteries freshly replaced. It wasn't just fatigue. The cave itself seemed to be closing around them, reshaping into narrower veins. At a little over 2,000 meters down, the temperature began to climb. At first, Marcus thought it was the heat of exertion, but the thermometer readings confirmed it. The air had warmed by almost 10 degrees since the last checkpoint. In theory, it should have dropped. The others noticed it too. Their breath came out in short, labored gasps, not from altitude but from a sensation of inhaling something thick, like mist made of heat. The metallic tang in the air sharpened. Every inhale tasted faintly of rust, of blood. They paused in a chamber where the rock walls shimmered as if covered in condensation. But when Marcus reached out, the surface was dry, the sheen not moisture but a mineral glow reflecting their light. Demidov ordered a brief rest. The team gathered near the equipment packs, sitting on coils of rope. No one spoke. Laurent was gone, Victor gone. Every missing face left a hollow that words could not fill. Marcus set the camera on the ground beside him, pointing it toward the darkness ahead. The lens caught the slow drift of dust motes glowing like suspended ash. When they resumed moving, the passage narrowed into a crevice barely wide enough for a single person. They crawled through, one at a time, dragging packs behind them. The sound of scraping metal and fabric echoed ahead, disorienting in its delay. Marcus was fourth in line. The rock pressed against his sides, his breath shallow, heartbeat loud in his ears. The heat increased steadily. Sweat gathered on his neck, trickling down into his shirt. Somewhere behind him, Irina muttered a prayer in Georgian under her breath, her voice trembling. The words faded quickly, devoured by stone. Then came the smell. Stronger now, unmistakable, iron and something organic, the raw scent of decay masked beneath the mineral dust. Marcus felt it before he recognized it, an instinctive tightening in his gut. It wasn't the sterile odor of earth. It was the smell of something that had once been alive. He kept moving, the camera mounted on his chest still recording. The beam of his light shook with every motion, darting across the rock until it caught something that made him stop. Ahead, at shoulder height, the wall bore a cluster of deep scratches. Not straight this time, but curved, overlapping, forming a crude spiral. He raised a hand and traced one of the grooves with his glove. The stone was warmer there, almost hot. His fingertips tingled through the fabric as though the rock vibrated faintly. He called out to Demidov, but the leader was already ahead, vanishing into the next bend. Marcus hesitated, then followed. The tunnel opened suddenly into a large chamber. The shift was so abrupt it felt like stepping from a throat into a lung. The ceiling rose out of sight, and the air grew strangely turbulent. Here, the warmth was unmistakable, a steady current flowing upward from below, brushing against their faces like exhalation. The sensation was wrong in every possible way. Air should have been still this deep, trapped and cold, but this air was alive. Irina's voice came through the static-filled radio, thin and panicked. "There's movement," she said, "in the readings." But before anyone could ask, her light swung toward the far wall. A crack ran across it, thin, no more than a few inches wide, but from within that crack poured a faint stream of vapor. Marcus stepped closer. The air that flowed out was warm, not lukewarm, but body warm, carrying the unmistakable scent of soil and something metallic. He crouched, holding a small sensor near the opening. The temperature jumped several degrees. Demidov warned him to stay back, but curiosity was stronger. Marcus leaned closer, watching the vapor rise. It curled like smoke, not dissipating but moving with purpose, drifting upward and vanishing into the dark above. The longer he watched, the more he sensed that the air coming out wasn't random. It pulsed faintly, matching a rhythm. He realized what it reminded him of: breathing. Slow, deep inhalations and exhalations, steady as sleep. He recorded everything, speaking softly into the microphone. 2010 meters. Airflow from within the rock, warm. Direction, outward, toward us. It's rhythmic. His own voice trembled as he said it. He glanced at the others. Irina refused to look. The medic, pale and sweating, murmured that she felt dizzy. The others shifted uneasily, drawn between awe and fear. Then came the noise. It began as a faint hum, so low that Marcus thought it was an electronic feedback. But it wasn't coming from the equipment. It came from the crack itself. The sound deepened, layered with tones that seemed to fold over one another. It wasn't random vibration, it was organized, patterned. There was almost a sense of intention. Demidov barked an order, his voice cutting through the noise. "We go back." But before they could move, the hum turned into a sharp metallic resonance that filled the chamber like the ringing of a struck bell. The walls trembled. Dust rained from above. Irina screamed that the pressure was spiking. Marcus felt it too, the shift in air as though the mountain had inhaled deeply, gathering strength. He stumbled backward, pulling his camera against his chest. The hum abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. For several long seconds, no one moved. Then, from deep within the crack, came a sound that froze every muscle in Marcus's body. It was not mechanical. It was not geological. It was a single, low exhale, long and soft, unmistakably alive. They withdrew in near panic, the professional discipline that had carried them this far unraveling. Back in the previous chamber, Demidov ordered a halt. His voice shook as he told them they would ascend the next morning. "We've seen enough," he said, though his eyes betrayed the same disbelief that Marcus felt. "We're not equipped for whatever this is." No one argued. They sat in silence, their lamps dimmed to save power. The warmth of the air persisted, wrapping around them like an invisible current. Marcus replayed his footage on the small screen. At first, nothing unusual. Just the vapor, the shifting shadows. But near the end of the clip, before the hum began, something flickered deep within the crack. A blur of motion, subtle and brief. He magnified the frame. It was impossible to define. A distortion of light, a shape without edges. Then, a single frame later, a shadow crossed the foreground, as if something had passed directly in front of the lens. He froze the image, staring at it until his vision blurred. It wasn't fear that filled him now, but realization. Whatever existed beyond that fissure wasn't inert. It wasn't rock or wind or gas. It was something aware. Sleep was impossible. The others tried, their bodies curled against the stone, but Marcus stayed awake, listening. The warmth fluctuated in steady intervals. Every so often, a faint tremor rippled through the ground beneath them, subtle enough to mistake for heartbeat. The sound came again, distant this time, a slow, low vibration, like breath drawn through an immense throat. Sometime, near what their watches marked as dawn, Marcus noticed moisture forming on his camera lens. He wiped it away, only for it to return instantly, thicker, as if the air itself were condensing into water. When he looked toward the tunnel leading back to the crack, he saw faint tendrils of vapor drifting outward, curling through the chamber like smoke. They weren't random. They moved in synchronized pulses, each coinciding with the tremors underfoot. The cave was exhaling again. He recorded the phenomenon until his battery nearly died, capturing the vapor's movement. The footage showed the mist expanding and retracting rhythmically, responding to some unseen force below. At one point, when he leaned too close to the wall, He felt a sudden gust of warm air against his face, like the breath of something vast moving just behind the stone. He stumbled back, the camera shaking. When the air settled, the wall was quiet again, its surface glistening faintly. The decision to retreat came swiftly after that. Even Demidov, who had dismissed every previous anomaly, looked shaken. They packed in silence, avoiding one another's eyes. Before leaving, Marcus aimed his camera once more at the fissure. The lens focused just long enough to capture the vapor thinning, retreating back into darkness, as if the mountain were closing its mouth. As they began their ascent, the silence between them was almost unbearable. The radios remained off. No one wanted to risk hearing another voice that wasn't theirs. Marcus moved last, the faint glow of the fissure behind him fading with every step. Yet, even as they climbed, he could still feel it. The pulse of the air through the stone, the faint vibration that followed the rhythm of his heartbeat. Hours passed before they reached a stable plateau. Everyone collapsed to rest. Marcus sat apart, removing his gloves and pressing his hands to the rock floor. It was still warm. When he closed his eyes, he could feel the vibration echoing faintly through his bones, a whisper that wasn't sound but memory. He understood, without reason or evidence, that they hadn't simply stumbled upon a natural anomaly. They had awakened something that had always been there, buried deep, patient and ancient, waiting for a disturbance. He thought of Victor's words, the madness in his voice when he said they were not alone. Now, Marcus knew he had been right. The warmth around them wasn't random, it was awareness, observation. The cave was not inert matter, but a living system, and they were inside it, tiny organisms moving through its veins. When he finally drifted into a shallow, restless sleep, his dreams were filled with the sound of slow, steady breathing. It followed him upward, through endless tunnels, through the twisting shafts of rock, always behind him, never closer, yet never gone. When he woke, the warmth had lessened, but the impression remained. The mountain had inhaled once more. It was waiting. They resumed the climb to the next station in the early hours. The group spoke little, their faces drawn and pale. The scent of metal still clung to their clothes, stubborn and persistent. As they moved, Marcus felt the weight of his camera pulling against his chest, heavier than before, as if the device itself carried part of what it had seen. Each click of the carabiner, each sound of rope sliding through the anchor points, was met with the same slow echo, an echo that no longer felt like sound rebounding off stone, but like an answer. When the faint glow of the higher chamber finally appeared ahead, Marcus exhaled in relief. But before he stepped into it, he glanced once more into the blackness behind them. The vapor had vanished completely. The fissure was silent. Yet he couldn't shake the certainty that the warmth they had felt had not been lost. It had simply moved, following them upward through the rock, patient as a breath drawn and held. He turned off the camera. For the first time, he didn't want to record. Some things, he realized, were not meant to be remembered in images. Some were meant only to be felt, to linger in the lungs like air that had been borrowed from something else and would one day have to be returned. They began their retreat in silence, carrying with them the heat and breath of the cavern like invisible passengers. No one spoke about the fissure or the exhale that had rippled through the chamber. The event had stripped them of words, leaving only the steady, mechanical rhythm of survival. Every movement upward felt heavier than before, not because of gravity, but because the mountain seemed to resist them now, as if the very stone wished to keep them inside. The ropes trembled under their hands, their echoes vanishing too quickly into the dark. Marcus followed last again, his camera swinging against his chest. He no longer looked through the lens. The act of filming now felt obscene, as though pointing it into the shadows might invite something to look back. The warmth of the previous chamber clung to him, radiating through his clothes like fever. The taste of metal was constant, thick on his tongue. He moved without thinking, one boot after another, the rope cutting into his gloves, the flicker of the headlamps above him shrinking to a faint glimmer. The cave-mouth changed as they climbed. The air grew thinner, but not colder. The rock pressed closer, its walls slick with condensation that shimmered faintly under the lights. At one point, when Marcus placed his hand against the wall to steady himself, he felt it pulse beneath his palm, a faint rhythmic vibration, alive. He jerked his hand away, his heart pounding, but when he looked again, the stone was still. He told himself it was fatigue, the blood in his own veins echoing through his bones. Yet the unease stayed. They reached a section where the tunnel narrowed to a steep shaft. Demidov went first, hammering in anchors, his movements deliberate but slower than before. The others followed one by one. The sound of their metal clips striking the rock filled the shaft with a hollow rhythm. When Marcus attached his line and began to climb, the vibration returned, stronger now, traveling up through the soles of his boots. It was not the tremor of distant machinery or shifting stone. It was too steady, too measured. Each pulse came like a slow heartbeat, matching the rhythm that had haunted them since the fissure. Halfway through the ascent, a sound cracked through the silence, a metallic groan, followed by a deep rumble. Dust rained from above. Someone shouted, their voice swallowed by the echo. Then came the shattering noise of rock breaking free. The shaft convulsed, and for an instant Marcus felt weightless. The world tilted. His rope snapped taut, jerking his body hard against the wall. Pain shot through his ribs. A cascade of stone thundered down, crashing past him. Lights flickered, then vanished one by one. When the rumble stopped, he realized he was hanging in total darkness. The only sound was his own ragged breathing. His harness bit into his hips. He called out, but the echoes distorted his voice, stretching it into something unrecognizable. Far above, someone's headlamp flickered faintly. He tried to climb, pulling against the rope, but the wall had shifted, the surface now slick with falling debris. The air was thick with dust, choking him. Somewhere below, a faint voice cried out, then fell silent. He climbed higher, every movement an agony. When he reached a ledge, he collapsed onto it, coughing, his throat raw. His hands were bleeding through the gloves. He switched on the small backup lamp attached to his belt. The beam cut through the dust, revealing the devastation. The shaft had partially collapsed. Chunks of stone and twisted rope hung where his teammates should have been. There was no sign of movement, only the faint sound of pebbles settling like the afterthought of an earthquake. He called for Demidov, for Irina, for anyone, but no answer came. The radio hissed with static when he tried it. The channels were dead. For a long moment, he just sat there, the weight of the silence pressing on him like another layer of rock. Then he heard it. The same low hum that had preceded the exhale in the chamber below. It came from the newly opened fissure behind him, soft and resonant. The air warmed again. The hum grew deeper, vibrating through the ledge into his bones. He turned the lamp toward the fissure. The opening was narrow, jagged, as though the collapse had torn the cave's skin apart. From within, a faint light glowed, a dull red pulsing faintly, like the ember of some distant fire. Marcus stared at it, transfixed. The air flowing from the fissure carried the same scent as before, metallic and warm. His rational mind screamed that it was dangerous, that he should climb up, find the others, but the pull was irresistible. He crawled closer, his camera still recording automatically. The glow brightened slightly as he approached, revealing a slope leading downward. He felt the heat radiating from below, not enough to burn, but enough to make the air shimmer. When he leaned closer to peer inside, the lamp flickered, distorting the shadows. For a brief moment, he thought he saw movement within the red light, shapes shifting like silhouettes cast through water. Then the lamp went out completely. Darkness swallowed him. The hum deepened, turning into a resonance that filled his head, vibrating in his teeth. His pulse quickened. Then, beneath the hum, came another sound, a faint dragging, as though something immense were moving through the tunnels far below. The sound climbed slowly, deliberate, not like falling rock, but like something crawling. Panic broke through the trance. Marcus scrambled backward, slipping on the loose stones. His hand struck the wall, sending a shock of warmth through his skin. He turned and began to climb again, his breath coming in gasps. The light above flickered. Someone was alive. Relief surged through him. He shouted, the sound cracking in his throat. The light grew brighter. It was Irina's voice that answered faintly, trembling. "Marcus, are you—" Her words were cut off by a sound so unnatural it froze him in place. It was a low moan, drawn out and echoing, neither human nor mechanical. The walls quivered in response. Then everything fell silent again. He climbed until his arms burned, reaching the next ledge where Irina and another survivor, Alexei the engineer, waited. Both were covered in dust, their faces pale, their eyes wide and hollow. Demidov was gone, buried somewhere below. No one spoke of retrieving him. The silence between them was agreement. They had to move. The air smelled even stronger of metal now, and there was a faint warmth rising through the shaft as though the mountain itself were exhaling beneath them. They found a passage leading upward, partly collapsed but navigable. Irina went first, crawling through the debris. Marcus followed close behind, his headlamp lighting the narrow path. Every few feet, he glanced back. The red glow from below had not faded. If anything, it seemed brighter now, spreading faintly across the rock, reflecting off the walls in a soft, pulsing shimmer. When they finally emerged into a wider corridor, they stopped to rest. Alexei sat with his back to the wall, shaking uncontrollably. His lips moved, but no sound came. Irina whispered that he was in shock. Marcus checked his pulse. It was erratic, rapid. The man's eyes were unfocused, staring into the dark as though he still saw something moving there. Marcus waved his hand in front of Alexei's face. No response. Then, slowly, Alexei raised his trembling hand and pointed toward the wall opposite them. Marcus turned the light. The wall was slick with moisture, glistening faintly. Then, as he watched, droplets began to form patterns, thin streams of water that traced upward, defying gravity, converging into lines that resembled claw marks. He stumbled back, the beam trembling. Irina gasped, covering her mouth. The lines deepened as they watched, as if something on the other side was pressing against the stone. Then the motion stopped. The wall went still. The only evidence was the sheen of moisture left behind. They moved on, faster now, driven by instinct. The tunnel sloped upward, but each step seemed to lead them deeper into something unseen. The vibration followed them, faint at first, then stronger. The hum turned rhythmic again, matching their footsteps. At one point, Marcus felt the ground shift beneath him, not with the randomness of a tremor, but with purpose, like the slow inhale of a sleeping creature disturbed. Hours passed, though time no longer meant anything down there, before they reached another vast chamber. This one was different. The air was stiflingly hot, the walls glistening as though coated in sweat. In the center stretched a shallow pool of black water, still and glass-like. Vapor rose from its surface, forming slow twisting shapes that almost resembled faces when caught by the light. Marcus approached cautiously, shining his beam across it. He could see no bottom. The reflection of their lights rippled like the movement of eyes watching from beneath. Irina whispered that they should go around it. Marcus nodded, but before they could move, Alexei stepped forward abruptly, drawn as if by a magnet. He stopped at the water's edge, staring down into it. Marcus reached for him, but before he could speak, Alexei stepped into the pool. The water accepted him silently, swallowing him in seconds without a splash. Irina screamed his name, falling to her knees, her voice echoing wildly around the chamber. The surface of the pool quivered, then stilled. There was no trace of him. Marcus pulled her back, his mind blank with disbelief. The water was motionless now, the vapor rising in slow coils. The hum that had followed them ceased completely, replaced by a silence so deep it hurt the ears. Then, from beneath the surface, came a single ripple, spreading outward in perfect circles. The air thickened, pressing down on them. The pool began to tremble, and in its depths something shifted, something vast. He didn't wait to see it. He dragged Irina by the arm, half carrying her toward the far exit. She sobbed as they ran, the sound echoing like laughter twisted by distance. The ground trembled again, stronger this time, and a wave of heat swept through the tunnel behind them. The air shimmered, carrying the unmistakable sound of breath drawn through the water. They reached a narrow slope leading upward. Marcus climbed first, pulling Irina with him. The vibration followed, crawling through the stone. At one point, the slope collapsed beneath his feet, sending him sliding into a lower crevice. He hit the ground hard, pain exploding through his leg. His light landed several feet away, casting long shadows across the new chamber. It was smaller, circular, the walls slick with moisture. He tried to stand, his leg trembling. Then he saw it. The center of the chamber opened into a pit, perfectly round, filled with dark water like the pool above. The surface rippled, not from his movement, but from something stirring beneath. He stared, frozen, as faint shapes appeared beneath the surface, outlines that looked disturbingly human, drifting just below visibility. The air here was warm and wet, each breath tasting of iron and stone. He lifted his camera with shaking hands. Through the lens, the water seemed to move differently, slower, as if time lagged beneath the surface. The shapes coalesced into vague silhouettes, their movements deliberate, reaching upward. Then, from the pit, came a sound, a deep, resonant knock that echoed through his chest. Once, twice, then silence. The hum began again, louder than before, filling the chamber with vibration. The water shuddered. The silhouettes vanished. Marcus turned, limping toward the slope. He heard Irina calling his name faintly from above, her voice distant and distorted. He climbed, every muscle screaming, his leg burning with pain. When he finally reached the top, she pulled him up, her hands slick with sweat and dust. Together they collapsed, gasping. Behind them, the chamber remained still. The hum faded slowly, replaced by the steady sound of dripping water. Marcus looked back once, just long enough to see that the pool below was now perfectly calm. In its surface, his lamp's reflection shimmered briefly, then dimmed, as if a shadow had passed over it. They didn't speak. They simply moved upward, guided by instinct and the desperate urge to see light again. Marcus's thoughts blurred into fragments: the warmth, the breath, the red glow. The mountain no longer felt like stone around them. It felt like flesh. Every tunnel was a vein, every vibration a pulse, and they were still inside it, still part of its rhythm. When they finally stopped to rest, he recorded a short message, his voice barely audible. "If anyone finds this, we're deeper than we should be. The cave breathes. It feels us. It's alive." He shut the camera off. The sound of dripping water echoed like an answer. He closed his eyes, but sleep did not come. The memory of the water, the silhouettes beneath it, stayed with him. They had not seen the face of what lived below, but they had heard its breath, felt its heartbeat. The cave was not just a place anymore. It was awake, and it knew they were still inside. The climb began without a word. After Alexei's disappearance, after the pool and its impossible silence, Marcus and Irina were no longer explorers. They were escapees, survivors of something that was still breathing somewhere beneath them. Their movements were mechanical, driven not by hope but by instinct, the need to rise, to feel distance between themselves and the living dark below. The warmth followed them still, clinging to their skin like fever, but the air had changed. It no longer pulsed in rhythm. It felt dead, stale, as if the cave itself were holding its breath. The headlamps cast long, trembling cones of light as they crawled through the narrow ascent. The walls were close enough to scrape their shoulders. Every movement made small sounds, metal on rock, breath on stone, that vanished almost immediately, swallowed by something denser than silence. At one point, Irina slipped and caught herself on Marcus's harness. Her hands were shaking, her eyes wide with exhaustion and terror. He didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. The sounds of their own bodies had become alien, out of place in a world that seemed to reject them. After an hour, or maybe several, time had ceased to exist. They reached a plateau where the tunnel widened into an open chamber. The floor was slick and uneven, but for the first time in what felt like eternity, they could stand upright. The air here was colder, but it carried a faint smell of rot, the same metallic tang, but now muted by the sourness of decay. Irina sank to the ground, clutching her radio as if it were a talisman. Marcus sat beside her, removing his gloves. The skin of his palms was blistered, the edges of the cuts blackened by dust and blood. He checked the camera automatically, a habit more than a decision. The lens was cracked, the battery indicator flashing red, but it still worked. He turned it on and recorded their faces, pale, hollow, eyes too large in the glare. "Sixth day," he whispered. "2 survivors, unknown depth, possible collapse behind us. The air temperature fluctuates but stays warm and pulses. We're heading up." His voice sounded wrong, flat, drained of emotion, as if it belonged to someone else. He stopped recording without finishing. Irina turned on her radio again. Static filled the chamber, thick and constant. She adjusted the frequency, her hands trembling. For a few moments, there was nothing but white noise. Then a faint pattern emerged, soft, rhythmic, almost like breathing. Marcus stared at the device. "It's feedback," Irina said, though she didn't sound convinced. She lowered the volume, her lips pressed tightly together. "Just feedback." He nodded, though both of them knew it wasn't. They stayed there for a while, listening to the hum of the static. At some point, Marcus realized he could no longer feel the vibration beneath his feet. The heartbeat of the mountain had stopped. For a moment, that seemed like relief, but then he felt something worse, a void, as if the absence of that pulse left a silence too deep to exist naturally. The air pressed down on them, heavy and stagnant. He imagined the mountain, listening, waiting. When they resumed their ascent, fatigue made every movement agonizing. Irina's breathing had grown shallow, and she moved slower with each step. Marcus had to pull her forward at times. The tunnels twisted unpredictably, branching into paths that led upward and others that curved into nothingness. More than once, they chose wrong and had to turn back. Each dead end carried a new horror, a cavern that seemed to stretch infinitely into darkness, a narrow corridor where the walls pulsed faintly with heat, a shaft where the air shimmered like a mirage. At one point, they came across a narrow ledge overlooking a vast drop. Marcus aimed his lamp downward, expecting nothing but blackness. Instead, the beam caught movement, slow, rolling undulations like the surface of liquid stone far below. He froze, unable to breathe. The surface shifted again, and a faint glimmer of red pulsed within it, rhythmic and deliberate. Irina saw it too. She clutched his arm so tightly that her nails dug into his skin. They didn't speak. They turned and continued climbing without looking back. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. The air thinned further, and with it came dizziness. Marcus's thoughts began to fracture. He saw flashes that made no sense. Sunlight through leaves, his mother's hands, the desert sky of Afghanistan. At one point, he thought he heard children laughing above him, their voices echoing faintly. But when he stopped, the sound disappeared. Irina began to mutter under her breath again, the same short prayer repeated over and over. The words blended with the scraping of their boots, forming a dull rhythm that held them together. Eventually, they found another chamber, smaller than the rest, shaped like a hollow sphere. The air here was different, fresher, cooler. Marcus dared to hope they were nearing the surface. They rested there, sharing the last of their water. Irina leaned against the wall, her eyes half closed. Marcus watched her breathing, shallow but steady. For a moment, he believed they might actually make it out. Then he noticed something strange. The condensation on the walls moved in patterns, sliding upward in thin streams, converging in the center of the ceiling. It was the same motion he had seen before in the lower tunnels, the upward flow that defied gravity. He reached for his camera, turned it on despite the warning light. The screen flickered. Through the lens, the patterns were clearer, lines of moisture forming shapes, curling and interlocking until they resembled faint outlines of hands pressing from the other side. He lowered the camera and looked directly. The shapes were gone, replaced by normal streaks of water. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to believe he'd imagined it. Then Irina stirred. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Marcus listened. At first, nothing. Then, faintly, a murmur, distant but distinct. Voices, too many to count, echoing through the rock. They weren't cries or screams, but conversations, soft and continuous, as if a crowd were speaking somewhere beyond the walls. The language was unfamiliar, but the tone carried meaning, curiosity, questioning, sorrow. Irina's face went pale. She pressed the radio to her ear, convinced the sound was coming from it, but the device was off. The voices grew louder, overlapping, surrounding them. Marcus grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the exit. As they crawled through the narrow passage, the voices followed, fading and rising like waves. At times, they seemed close enough to touch. At others, they vanished entirely, leaving only their echoes in his head. When they emerged into another tunnel, the sound stopped abruptly. The silence was complete again. Marcus leaned against the wall, gasping. Irina was trembling, tears streaking the dust on her face. She whispered something in Georgian. He didn't understand the words, but he recognized the tone. It was a plea. They continued upward. The slope became steeper, the stone smoother, polished by centuries of water flow. Marcus's hands slipped more than once. Irina stumbled frequently, and he had to haul her up by the harness. Their lights dimmed, batteries near exhaustion. Darkness pressed closer, thick and heavy. Somewhere in that darkness something moved. He felt it before he heard it. A shift of air, a subtle displacement, like the passing of a large body through a confined space. He turned sharply, his light sweeping across the tunnel. Nothing. But the warmth returned, brushing against his neck like a slow breath. He switched off the lamp, holding Irina still. They waited, listening. The warmth pulsed once, then again, and with it came a sound so faint he thought he imagined it, a whisper, drawn out and low, just above the threshold of hearing. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was familiar. The same voice from the fissure, the same slow, deliberate cadence. The mountain was speaking again. He turned the light back on, half expecting to see the walls move in, but the rock was motionless. Irina began to sob quietly. Marcus took her hand and kept moving, refusing to look back. They followed the slope until the air grew cooler again, until their lungs no longer burned with heat. The change was gradual, imperceptible, but real. Hope returned in cautious fragments. When the next chamber appeared, it was smaller, irregularly shaped, its floor littered with fragments of broken equipment, rusted carabiners, torn ropes, an old flashlight whose battery had long since corroded. Marcus recognized the make. It was Soviet, decades old. He realized that they were walking through the remnants of an older expedition, maybe one of those who had vanished years ago. The sight filled him with a strange dread. The objects were covered in dust, but the arrangement was wrong. They weren't scattered randomly. They were aligned neatly against the wall, as if placed there intentionally. Irina picked up a helmet. Its visor was cracked, the inside blackened by something that wasn't dust. She dropped it quickly. They moved on without speaking. The realization followed them like a shadow. Someone or something had gathered those artifacts. The air pressure changed again, the temperature dropping sharply. Their breath became visible in the beam of the lamps. For the first time in hours, Marcus felt the unmistakable chill of the upper layers of the cave. He almost smiled. They might actually reach the surface. The thought gave him a surge of strength. Irina noticed it too. "We're close," she whispered. "It's colder." Her voice cracked on the last word. They climbed faster, following the narrowing tunnel that spiraled upward. A sound of dripping water returned, rhythmic and steady. Marcus began to recognize the smell of earth, fresh, damp, real. The world above was near enough to taste. He could almost imagine the wind, the light, the sky. The hope was so tangible that it blinded him to the change that came next. The radio on Irina's belt crackled suddenly to life. The static was loud, sharp. They froze. Through the noise came a sound. A single word, distorted but clear. Marcus's name. He stared at the device as the voice repeated it, soft and elongated, not hers, not any humans. Marcus. The sound stretched, bending into a sigh. Irina turned it off, her hands shaking. "Don't," she said, "don't answer it." They kept climbing, faster now, almost running. The tunnel narrowed again, forcing them into a crouch. The air grew colder with each meter, but behind them the warmth returned, slow and steady, rising through the stone like pursuit. The mountain was breathing again, exhaling up through the tunnels toward them. The lights flickered violently. Marcus could feel the vibration through his hands, the same rhythm that had haunted them since the beginning. It was coming closer. When they reached the final chamber, the ceiling opened into a narrow vertical shaft. Faint drafts of cold air descended from above. The surface couldn't be far. They tied their last rope and began to climb. Marcus went first, the rough stone biting into his palms. Every few feet, he glanced down to ensure Irina was still behind him. She was, her face pale in the flickering light. The air grew colder still, almost freezing now. He dared to believe they would see daylight within the hour. Then came the sound, the low, hollow resonance that had become the cave's voice. It rose from the depths, vibrating through the rope, through their bodies, through the stone. Irina screamed his name. He looked down. The light from her lamp was shaking violently, the beam dancing across the walls. She was frozen, staring into the darkness below. The rope trembled between them. "Climb!" he shouted. She didn't move. Then the light went out. He called her name again, voice cracking. No answer. The silence returned, deep and absolute. He hung there for several minutes, waiting, calling, pleading, but there was nothing. At last, he climbed upward alone, every motion a prayer. His hands were numb, his body exhausted, but he didn't stop until he felt the air grow thin and cold and still. When he pulled himself onto the final ledge, he saw it, the faint shimmer of daylight filtering through a crack in the rock above. It was gray and dim, but it was light. He collapsed onto the stone, gasping, tears streaming down his face. He was alive. The mountain had let him go. Hours later, when rescuers found him wandering near the ridge, he didn't speak. He couldn't. His clothes were torn, his camera clutched tightly in one hand. They carried him down to a base camp where he sat motionless, staring at nothing. When they finally played back his recordings, they found hours of footage. Shadows, vapor, walls that seemed to breathe. But near the end, just before the final climb, there was sound. A faint whisper close to the microphone, human, but not. It spoke in a language no one could identify. Only one phrase repeated clearly enough to understand. "You woke us." After that, the footage cut to black. The authorities sealed the area within weeks, citing safety concerns. Official reports spoke of cave-ins, toxic gases, and psychological stress. Marcus gave his statement mechanically, repeating what they wanted to hear. Collapse, disorientation, hallucinations. But in the quiet of the hospital room, when the lights were dim and the machines hummed softly, he could still feel the warmth rising through the floor beneath him. Sometimes, when the night was especially silent, he thought he could hear it again. The slow, steady rhythm, the mountain's breath, waiting for him to return. Marcus Daniels never dreamed anymore, not in the way he used to, with scenes and memories, people and voices. What came to him in the nights after his rescue were not dreams but returns, darkness and sound, depth and warmth. He would wake soaked in sweat, the room silent except for the faint throb of his pulse, and for a few seconds he wouldn't know whether he was still underground. It was always the air that betrayed him, the flat, still air of a hospital ward that lacked the weight and breath of the mountain. That, and the fact that the silence above the earth was somehow more unbearable than the one below. Weeks passed before he could walk again without the tremor in his hands. His body recovered faster than his mind. Doctors spoke to him gently, their voices carefully neutral, the way one speaks to men who have survived something they shouldn't have. They called it post-traumatic shock. They said isolation, sensory distortion, and deprivation could make the mind fabricate entire realities. They suggested therapy, medication, and distance from anything resembling caves. Marcus nodded at all of it. He agreed with everything they said. He lied. When the foundation that had funded the expedition came to debrief him, they arrived as a pair. One Russian, one American, both too polite, both asking the same questions in different accents. What had he seen? What had caused the deaths? How had he survived the collapse? He gave them the same story he had rehearsed: partial structural failure, disorientation, loss of communication, suffocation risk, panic. He described falling rocks and losing his teammates in darkness. He described crawling through debris and finding a way upward by instinct. He left out the hum, the warmth, the breath, the voices. He left out Irina's scream. When they asked for his camera, he handed it over, though his grip lingered on it longer than necessary. It had become a relic, the only piece of that world he still trusted. They promised to analyze the footage and return it. They never did. He didn't expect them to. He was moved to a quiet facility outside Tbilisi for observation. The walls there were white, the windows narrow. At night, the building made soft noises as it cooled, the crack of metal, the whisper of pipes. Every sound reminded him of the cave. He began to measure his time not by clocks, but by breaths. The mountain had taught him that everything living had a rhythm, even stone. Sometimes, when the orderlies entered his room, he would ask them to pause and listen. "You hear that?" he'd whisper. They'd look around, confused, and shake their heads. The silence for them was empty. For him, it pulsed. The nightmares changed as the days lengthened. They no longer began in darkness. Instead, they began in light, a gray, colorless light that seemed to hum faintly. He would be standing at the edge of a fissure, watching the vapor rise, and somewhere deep below he could hear movement. Not chaotic, not violent, methodical, deliberate, like something stirring after centuries of sleep. Sometimes it spoke, the words indistinct, but the tone was the same one he had heard through the radio. Not anger, not cruelty, but curiosity. The same question always reshaped in new ways. Why did you come? He started to write again, filling notebooks with sketches and fragments, maps of tunnels he had memorized, notes about temperature changes, about the rhythm of the vibrations, about the way sound behaved differently below certain depths. The staff thought it was therapy, a way of externalizing his trauma. They didn't know that he wasn't documenting memories. He was charting a pulse. Each night, when he placed his hand on the metal frame of his bed, he could feel it faintly, a vibration so deep it seemed to come from the bones of the earth. One evening, weeks after his transfer, a visitor came. She introduced herself as Dr. Karen Weller, a geologist from a research institute in Germany. She said she had worked with the same foundation that funded the Barry Obkin expedition. She carried a file in her arms, worn at the edges, and a quiet, patient smile that didn't reach her eyes. She spoke softly, carefully, as though every word was being measured. "Mr. Daniels," she said, "you're not the only one who's heard it." He stared at her, unsure what she meant. She opened the file. Inside were photographs, grainy black and white images of caverns, fissures, and subterranean lakes. They were older than his expedition, labeled in Russian and Georgian, some dating back to the 1970s. Several showed carved markings on stone, spirals, and upward lines like the scratches he'd seen deep below. She turned one photo toward him. This was taken during the Soviet survey of the same cave system, she said. They sealed it afterward. Officially, they claimed flooding. Unofficially, she hesitated, then looked at him directly. They reported acoustic anomalies, rhythmic vibrations that caused hallucinations. The team leader wrote in his notes that it was not sound, but intent. Marcus said nothing. His throat felt dry. She studied him for a long moment, then slid another page toward him. It was a transcript, typed, faded. The words were in English now, translated. At the bottom, a line of dialogue stood out in bold letters. The cave is not empty, it remembers. When he looked up, her expression had changed. There was something in her eyes that he recognized, the same uneasy curiosity that had driven him into the mountain in the first place. "You felt it too," he said quietly. She nodded once. "Our team detected low-frequency patterns beneath several sites across the Caucasus," she said. "Always the same pulse, spaced evenly. It's not seismic. It's not man-made. It moves." The meeting ended soon after. She thanked him, left her card, and promised to stay in touch. But that night, Marcus couldn't sleep. The conversation had awakened something he'd tried to bury. He stared out the window into the darkness, imagining the earth beneath him, layer upon layer of stone, the unseen tunnels stretching for miles, breathing, shifting, listening. He pressed his hand against the wall. The pulse was there again, faint but certain. He knew then that the mountain hadn't let him go. It had released him deliberately. Within a month, he was discharged from the facility. The doctors considered him stable enough to return home. He moved back to Atlanta, though home was too generous a word for the one-bedroom apartment that felt like a shadow of his former life. The noise of the city overwhelmed him at first. The constant hum of traffic, the drone of air conditioning, the chatter of unseen neighbors. He found himself drawn to quiet spaces, the park at dawn, the empty laundromat at night. He carried the habit of listening wherever he went. He tried to rebuild. He edited old footage, accepted minor freelance work, even answered a few calls from journalists curious about the man who survived the world's deepest cave. He told them nothing real, only what they wanted to hear, about darkness, about isolation, about fear. But at night, when he replayed his surviving fragments of footage, he heard things no one else noticed. Beneath the static and echoes, a pattern persisted, a faint hum pulsing steadily in the background. Once he isolated it, amplified it, he realized it wasn't random. The intervals were too precise. It was breathing. The discovery consumed him. He converted his apartment into a makeshift studio, covering the walls with maps and sound graphs. He worked for hours at a time, syncing the rhythm from his footage with geological data from other cave systems. The pulse appeared everywhere, in recordings from Asia, South America, even deep-sea hydrophone readings. Always the same tempo, always faint but constant. It was as if the planet itself carried the memory of that breath. One night, while comparing frequencies, his speakers emitted a sudden distortion, a low, rolling vibration that filled the room. It wasn't the recorded sound. It was live. The walls trembled slightly, the lights flickered. He froze, every muscle tense. Then, through the noise came something new. A whisper. It was soft, stretched thin by distance, but clear enough to understand. "You left too soon." He shut everything off and sat in the dark for a long time. His heartbeat refused to slow. In the following days, small disturbances began to appear. His mirrors fogged without reason. The floors of his building creaked in slow, rhythmic intervals, though no one was walking. Once, late at night, his neighbor knocked to ask if he was using a generator. "There's a vibration," the man said, frowning. "It feels like it's coming from your apartment." Marcus apologized, promising to check. When the neighbor left, he stood still in the center of the room and listened. The pulse was back, steady as ever. He began to understand what it meant to be marked by the mountain. It wasn't a scar one could see or a memory one could suppress. It was resonance. The mountain had not followed him. It had become part of him. The hum he heard wasn't external anymore. It was internal, fused to the rhythm of his own heart. In late autumn, he received a letter without a return address. Inside was a single page, no words, only a spectral image printed faintly in gray. It looked like an audio waveform, symmetrical and continuous. At the bottom, in neat handwriting, were 3 words: "It's wakin' again." He didn't sleep that night. He didn't even try. Instead, he packed a small bag, the essentials only: camera, batteries, notebook. The next morning, he bought a one-way ticket to Tbilisi. The clerk at the airport didn't question his silence or the distant look in his eyes. He was calm now, completely calm, as though the decision had been made long ago. When he reached the foothills of the Caucasus, winter had already begun to settle. Snow clung to the pines like ash. The old access road to the research base was closed, its gate rusted and chained, but he walked around it easily. The path was familiar, the scent of cold air mixed with iron and pine needles. The higher he climbed, the quieter the world became. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if afraid to disturb what slept beneath. By dusk, he reached the ridge where the cave entrance had once been sealed. The barrier of concrete and steel remained intact, but the mountain around it had shifted. Cracks ran through the surface, and from one of them, faint tendrils of vapor rose into the night air. The sight filled him with a strange peace. He placed his hand on the stone. It was warm. He sat there for a long time, camera beside him, recording the darkness. There was no fear now, only the steady rhythm of something ancient moving far below. When the first tremor came, a slow, deliberate shiver through the ground, he smiled. The mountain hadn't called him back to destroy him. It had called him back to remember, to listen, to bear witness. And as the vapor thickened, curling around him like breath, Marcus closed his eyes and whispered the only words that mattered. "I hear you." The ground pulsed once, softly, almost tenderly. Then the night grew still again, and the mountain exhaled. They descended into the deepest cave on earth, and no one was ready for what awaited them below. What began as a simple scientific expedition turned into an encounter with something that was never meant to exist. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from.